Today on the Wisdom Journey podcast, we have a true legend in the podcasting world, Dave Jackson. Since launching the School of Podcasting in 2005, Dave has helped thousands start and grow their shows. A Podcast Hall of Fame inductee, author of Profits from Your Podcast, and a powerhouse in the industry. He's here to share his insights on monetization, marketing, and making podcasting work for you. Get ready for an episode packed with wisdom, humor, and game-changing advice. Let's dive in. In your profile, you talked about what happened in 2005 and how it was a turning point in your life and all that. I would love for you to take me back to 2005 in your brother's basement. What was the exact moment you realized podcasting could be more than just a hobby?
Yeah, I think because back then you didn't have the technology, so it was much harder to start a podcast. And I had heard about it, and I literally had to kind of hand code one. And the minute I uploaded a file, and then I saw it come down in this other software, it dawned on me that this wasn't going to be like radio, where back then, again, this is before all the streaming stuff was going on. I went, oh, this is going to be global, and I will be able to learn from people in other countries, and because my background's in teaching. So if you give a podcast to a teacher, they want to teach and they want to learn. If you give a podcast to a marketer, they want to sell and they want to earn. And so when I realized that, oh, wait a minute, this is global. This doesn't have any regulations here in the United States. We have the FTC, which, kind of dictates what you can and can't say. So it was really anything you wanted to do and people could listen anywhere, that I went, this is really going to change the world. And it did. So I just remember seeing it coming down and kind of the light bulb in my head went off like, oh, wait a minute, I understand what this is now. Because when I originally searched for it in Google, there was 1.5 pages. And I was like, wait a minute, how do you spell this? Because I thought I'd broken the internet because there just wasn't much information about it. So wow. I think that was it. When I uploaded my first file and saw it come down, I went, oh, wait a minute, I see what this is now. And it really blew me away.
Yeah. I think 2005, podcasting was quite like what we call a small child. It was in its baby's phase.
Yeah. I mean, nobody knew what it was. And once I figured out what it was and I started listening to other shows, because there weren't that many back then, but I would ask somebody, because that's about that time I launched the School of Podcasting. And so I would find somebody who I thought would be a great person to start a podcast. And I would ask, have you ever heard of podcasting? And then you're like, do I need an iPod for that? And I'm like, no, because this is before the iPhone. And they're like, do I need an iPod for that? I'm like, no, you just need the internet and speakers. And so it was kind of hard when I first started because I would spend 3 to 5 minutes explaining what a podcast was, only to have that person say, yeah, I don't want to do that. So the early days was a little rough.
Yeah. Like compared to now, where it seems as if everything is, everything has been made easy.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I said, back then, I was kind of handwriting my RSS feed. Now, whether it's WordPress or your media host, those are built for you. There are services like podpage.com that will build a website for you. The technology, I mean, I've got a piece of equipment on my desk right here from Zoom called the PodTrack P4. And I don't know, 5 years ago, this was probably a piece of equipment that would have cost you $1,000, and now it's under $200. So the technology has gotten better, cheaper, smaller. So yeah, it's the actual like how to do it part has gotten much easier. You still have to figure out who your audience is, what do they want. Content creation hasn't gotten that much easier, but it is with, things like the internet and other things like that now. That is getting better, and a lot of people are using AI to generate content. I kind of have a love-hate relationship with that idea, but it definitely things are much easier than they were, almost 20 years ago.
Yeah. You in your profile, you talked about that how you went from bankruptcy and the job loss to being inducted into the Podcasting Hall of Fame, right? And for me, can you share with us what was the most soul-crushing moment in that journey, and how did that reshape your understanding of success?
Yeah, I was married at the time, and we were trying to get pregnant. And to kind of make somewhat of a long story shorter, we were using fertility treatments, which are really expensive. And so we thought we could try a couple times, and we did, and it didn't work. And so we started charging fertility treatments on a credit card, which is a really, really, really bad idea. But when your wife is crying and wants a baby, you kind of do whatever you can. And so I made some really bad decisions. And so we were really living like the ultimate paycheck to paycheck. I remember once I was at my job and I was thirsty and I was standing at a vending machine. And I remember thinking, wait a minute, do I want a Mountain Dew or do I want gas for the ride home? Because I was really, low on gas for my car. And I was like, yeah, if I don't, I'm thirsty, I can drink water, I guess. But that was pretty low. And just the fact that I was raised by a pretty strict father. And if you ever watched Game of Thrones, there was always that one family that a Lannister pays their bills, pays their debts. And that's kind of how I was raised. So I was never a person to wave the white flag and declare bankruptcy because, I promised that bank I would pay them back. And so what happened was we were living paycheck to paycheck. And then 9/11 hit eventually is what really was the final domino that, or actually, wait, I take that back. Because that was 9/11 was years later. But I just remember her hours got cut, and that's all it took because now we had, a couple $100 a month that used to be in our bank account, wasn't. And so it was just a case where it's like, well, we're going to lose everything. And so then you have to go through and so at that time, just to make things even worse, that's when my wife also announced that she had been unfaithful. So now we were going to throw a divorce into the mix. And so at the end of 2004, I had not only gone through bankruptcy, but I'd gone through a divorce. And it's kind of funny because I tell people you start with what you have wherever you are. And so my brother, because he's a saint, I was going to go get an apartment. And he said, no, because my brother had been through a divorce. He's like, you're going to be up to your eyeballs in lawyer bills and all this other stuff. He's like, come live with me. I've got a finished basement. He goes, you can help, drive the kids to school and stuff like that because I got nieces. And I said, no. He goes, no, don't be stupid. Come live in my basement. I was like, all right. And so I went and lived there. So I always tell people I have a picture where I had just this one room with a bed in it and a desk, and it was all messy. And I said, well, this is where the School of Podcasting was born. It's obviously that's not where I am now, but you kind of start with wherever you are. And that I ended up going back to college there because shortly 2004 was a great year. First, I went bankrupt and divorced, and then the job I had, I lost. And so I went back to college. My background's in teaching, but my original degree was in electronic engineering. I'd kind of backed my way into teaching. And so when I went to get a job in teaching, they're like, yeah, but your degree's in engineering. And I'm like, yeah, but look at my resume. And I just remember the one lady saying, I can't even talk to you if you don't have a degree in education. And so I went back to school and got a degree in education, which was humbling because you'd walk in and these other students that are in their 20s are like, oh, are you the teacher? And I'm like, no, I'm one of the students. So, but I got that degree. Sometimes life, you have those peaks and valleys. And so I dug my way back out and went back to the teaching. And then because I used to teach a lot of Microsoft Office along with things like time management and QuickBooks and stuff like that. And that job went away. And when that went away, I was like, I really love podcasting. I'd really love to, make a living in podcasting. And I was lucky enough that I knew people at a media host called Libsyn, which is the oldest media host around, and they're a great company. And I reached out and got a job over there, and I was there as the head of podcasting for 8 years. And now I'm at a company called Podpage. But yeah, that happened because of my podcast. They had been podcasting at that point for a while by the time this all went down after I got my teaching job. And so my podcast kind of served as a resume and got my reputation up there and grew my networks.
Yeah. In this episode, we want to talk about because everybody out there is talking about how podcasting can make you a millionaire, can change your life, and make you the next Bill Gates and stuff like that. But I want us to look at the non-monetary benefits of podcasting, like what it would actually do to you. There's this notion that what you work on works on you.
Yeah, there are a couple things. So number one, when the people say you can be a millionaire, well, you can also be a millionaire if you're an athlete. You can also be a millionaire if you're an author or a singer or an actor or a truck driver, or anybody can make money. It's just not a given thing. That's the part when people say, "Oh, I can get you to the top of the charts and you'll be famous and you'll make all this money." And there are ways you can hack things like that, but we have a show in the States, and there are a bunch of these in different countries where you vote on these singers. And, it's like, hey, I always say, who was season 6 winner of American Idol? And nobody knows. And I'm like, it's one thing to be put to the top of the charts. It's another thing to keep that audience. And so, yeah, I always tell people, yes, you can make money. And it's usually not one stream of income. I wrote a book called Profit from Your Podcast. And it talks about how it's not just one stream of income. Sure, you can get ads, but that's, in my opinion, one of the least profitable ways of doing it. The best way for me, if you want to make money with a podcast, is have a product or service that you sell and use the podcast to promote it. So you have your own products and services, and then you have what's called affiliate marketing, and that's when you are selling other people's products and services. And so when people buy microphones through my link at Amazon, I earn a small commission for that. So there's, selling my stuff, selling other people's stuff. Then there's crowdfunding. So you get into things like Patreon and Supercast. Then there's donations. So that's PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee. Then you get into advertising. And if you have, let's say, 10,000 downloads an episode, but realize less than 10% of podcasts get that number of downloads. So that means 90% don't. And people just kind of ignore that because they want to believe what they want to believe. But then you might get $20, and they call it CPM. It's per 1,000 downloads. Well, if I have 10,000 downloads and I get $20, that means I make $200 for the episode. Okay, but you do 4 a month. That's $800. You're not going to live on that. So it's a stream of income. And then what happens is some people will then just jam their podcast full of ads. Well, now nobody wants to listen to it because it's 30% ads. So it is a stream of income, but it's not that. And then the other thing that for me, it's the networking. It's not always who you know, but who knows you. And so I've had multiple jobs because of people I interviewed on the podcast. There was this kind of sounds like humble brag theater, but it's true. There was a large event called the New Media Expo, and it was blogging, it was YouTube, and it was podcasting. And the guy that ran their podcasting section quit. And so the head of the event called 3 different media hosts and said, who do you think we should get to fill the podcasting space? And all 3 of them said, Dave Jackson. And so he finally called me and he was like, hey, I just figured I might as well call you before I ask somebody else. And that's because I had interviewed all of those people on my podcast, and they all knew me, that I was a guy that talked about podcasting and helped people with podcasting. And so that was a case where I got that job based on my network from the podcast. And that paid, mountains more than anything I made with advertising. And it also then I met so many people there, like all of I had to hire speakers for that event. And so I got to meet Pat Flynn, who's a famous influencer, and Michael Stelzner, and all these other people that, I met. And I always say what happens is your podcast, it opens the doors for relationships, and you get to know these people. And those relationships lead to opportunities. And the opportunities, and it just keeps going around and around. Those opportunities lead to more relationships, which lead to more opportunities, and everything points at your podcast. And it takes a while. Everybody wants that to happen in 6 weeks or 6 months. And in my book, I go, it takes about 3 years to build an audience, and nobody likes that number, and I'm not a big fan of it. But everything I've read and everything I've seen, when I talk to somebody and they say, well, I really started making money, I go, well, how long did it take to do that? And almost all of them said about 3 years.
Yeah. I think for most of we like to, everybody is looking for the shortcut, the fast method, the quick recipe and everything. But what we fail to realize is that most of the things that is worth doing takes time.
Yeah, and doing it well. So many people, and I agree that you want to have a consistent publishing schedule, because when you do that, a few things happen. Number one, you're seen as being reliable and that you can be counted on. But so many people think if I just publish every Wednesday or whatever day they pick, and I do this long enough, then money will fall from heaven. And I get that thought, but it's probably more important to be consistent in quality, because I would much rather have a show that was maybe a day late. Normally it's put out on Tuesday, but it came out on Wednesday. But if it was good and it provided me information that does whatever it's supposed to make me do, whether it's inspirational or educational or entertainment or whatever it does, I'd much rather have a late show that was good than an on-time show that was, okay, that's 20 minutes of my life I can't get back. And so it's important to be consistent, but the true consistency is in the content, because I don't know about you, but if I'm reading a book and the first chapter, of course, the first chapter is always kind of boring. It's the preface and here's what we're going to get. And you're kind of like, all right, can we get to the content? And then you get to chapter 2 and you're like, okay. And then of chapter 3, you're kind of like, are we ever going to get to the meat and potatoes? There comes a time when I'm like, look, I'm only 4 chapters into this, but I haven't gotten any kind of golden nugget yet, so I'm out. And so if your podcast is kind of hit or miss, the more misses there are, the more chance that audience is going to go, there are, I don't know, 250,000 podcasts. I think I can find another one that might be doing this a little better.
Yeah. One of the things most creators see podcasting as a marketing tool, right? But you seem to suggest it's a platform for getting genuine connection, right?
Absolutely.
And you gave us a specific example of how that got you a job just because of the people who knew you.
Yeah, that's the New Media Expo. That's one of the first jobs I got. I also got a job at Chancellor University where I live. That was back when I was teaching. And in the interview, they said, "What are your hobbies?" And I said, "Well, I play the guitar. I like to ride my bike, and I podcast." And they went, "What? You do podcasting?" Because again, it was fairly new back then. And I said, "Yeah, I could see the university using this." I said, we could make a podcast about how to study better and, what's going on campus and just keep the students informed. And I think that's what got me the job. So I got that job there. When I worked at Libsyn, again, the reason I got that job is because I used to do a show with a guy there that was now vice president. And so I had been at it probably 5 years before I got hired there. I knew him. I went to all the events about podcasting, so I would see these people at events and keep those relationships going. And then I remember, it was probably about 4 years ago, and they were talking about different aspects of what people do. And somebody said, "Well, how long have you been at Libsyn?" And I said, "Oh, I've probably been there at that point about 5 years." And somebody said, "Well, if you ever get bored of Libsyn, we'd hire you over here." And so it was one of those things where, again, your podcast can kind of be your resume and a way of kind of showing people what you're talking about. And sometimes that means saying things that aren't always popular, but I always back up my stuff with, this is why I think what I think. So those are 3 jobs that I've got. But the other fun thing that's always interesting and kind of blows me away is I speak all over the place, and there'll be times when I'll be like, oh, I'm going to be speaking in, nowhere, Ohio, or some place that's, not a big giant city. And I will get an email from somebody that listens to my show and says, "Hey, you're going to be in my neck of the woods. Can I take you out for dinner?" And I'm always like, sure. And I'll send a message to my brother and I'm like, "Hey, in the event," because I'm going to dinner with somebody I really don't know. And I'm like, "Hey, in the event somebody kills me at dinner," his name was George, but it's interesting. That's always fun because they feel like they know you through your show, and I have no clue who they are. But that's always great to then find out, and you don't realize the impact you have on people. My very first podcast that I did was for musicians, and I had a guy come to my city, and he said, "You always said if I'm in Akron, Ohio, to look you up and I'll buy you pizza." And I go, "Well, absolutely buy you pizza." And so I met him at a restaurant, and he said, "Do you remember how you used to end your show?" And I go, "I don't remember what I had for breakfast, let alone what I said 20 years ago." And he said, "You would say, for those who have money, there is therapy, and for the rest of us, there is music." And I said that? And he goes, "Yeah." And I go, "That's not bad." And he goes, "Well, I just want to let you know, I'm now a professor at a university and I teach music." And he goes, "I start off every semester with that saying." And
Wow.
yeah, and I'm just like, okay, it was just me doing my thing, And so you have no idea how you're impacting people, and it's amazing when these different stories that come out.
Yeah. Now, for there are a lot of people who have been podcasting, and this is not what we like, or these results and these stories you shared with us. This is not exactly what everybody is guaranteed to get by podcasting. I think there's a psychology behind this kind of relationship, this kind of genuine connection. You've made some hints about it when you started sharing the stories, but I'd love for you to just take out some time and just share with us the psychology behind creating genuine, deep, meaningful connections through your podcast.
Yeah, I always say, kind of when you start off, spend $100 on a microphone and spend 100 hours figuring out who you're talking to.
Wow.
That's really where it starts, because if you don't know who your target audience is, and it can't be everybody. If you're like, "Oh, this is for everyone," I'm like, no, because even if you just said it's for males 20-55, that's still, there's a big difference between a 25-year-old male and a 55-year-old male. So it can't be
Yeah.
for everybody. But when you figure out who it is, and then you basically, because it's hard to launch a podcast. A lot of times we mentally get stuck. And so what happens then is, I always say, when your need to serve is greater than your fear of looking stupid, you will actually press record. And
Yeah.
so that's really where things go. And then as you start, I always say, answer every email, reply to every comment. I remember one time I had somebody send in a comment and their phone number was in their email signature. And so I just called it and I'm like, "Hey, is this, Scott?" And he's like, "Yeah." And I go, "Well, this is Dave Jackson." He's like, "It is not." And I go, "No, seriously, it is." And he's like, "Well, why are you calling me?" And I said, "Well, you sent me this comment." I said, "I just thought I'd call you. It'd be easier." And he was blown away, to where, that I know that you know that I know that I'm just Dave Jackson. But to this
Yeah.
guy, he's like, "Oh, this is the host of the School of Podcasting. Holy cow, I can't
Yeah.
believe he's calling me." And
Wow.
so the other thing I did, it was the best mistake I've ever done, is I have an email list and I always just try to get to know my audience. And I meant to send this to 10 people on my list. And it simply said, "Hey, I'm doing some research on some topics. I would really love your input. If you get a chance, go to this link and schedule a time where we could talk for like 20, 30 minutes. And it was supposed
Wow.
to, go to 10 people. It went to my entire list.
Wow.
And so for the next 2 weeks, I had back to back to back to back to back to back to back meetings. And when I first saw it, I was like, "Oh, you idiot." It was the best thing I ever did,
Yeah.
because I got on Zoom and I got to not only hear my audience, but see them. So I could see what they wanted, and they'd all kind of, in some cases, they'd be a little intimidated because there's that guy from my earbuds again, and holy cow, it's a real person. And I was just
Yeah.
like, well, in this case, they were all either podcasters or want to be podcasters. And I'm like, well, what's your main pain point? What are you trying to do that's hard? Or what can I do to help? And so I really wasn't talking a lot. I was mainly listening. But that was supposed to go to 10 people. And instead, I ended up with about, probably 30, 40 meetings. But it was the
Wow.
best thing I ever did, because I really got to understand who my audience was.
Yeah. Yeah. And you keep hammering on understanding the people, like the people you're trying to serve, the people
Right.
you creating content for, right? And
Mm-hmm.
for most persons, they're just about starting, right? They're even thinking of, okay, I want to start a podcast. And you're at a point where you were privileged to have an audience, and you wouldn't have had that audience if you didn't start anyway. But you had the audience, and you could message them and schedule time with them and talk with them, and get feedback from them. But what if I'm just starting out, and I have not even started the podcast, and I would love to know what my audience is thinking, so I can create content that serves them genuinely.
Yeah, there are a couple things you can do. Number one, I hang out in Reddit. I hang out in Facebook groups, all for podcasting because that's my target audience, and kind of see what they're talking about, because then I don't have to guess. I wonder what they're interested in. I can see. And so that's part of it. I will go to Amazon and I'll do a search for books on my topic. And then what I look for are 4-star reviews and 2-star reviews. Now, the reason I don't want 1 and 5-star reviews or 1-star reviews are, this is awful. Well, okay, but that's not very descriptive. A 5-star review is like, best book ever. But a 4-star review will be like, I really like this book, except they didn't do blank. And then a 2-star review is like, this was a pretty bad book, but they did do this. So you get a little more ideas on that. Another tip is you can go to YouTube, search for your topic, and that'll show you the top YouTubers for that topic. Go to that channel, go to their content, and sort it by popularity. And that will give you a list of the most popular topics on that channel about, your topic. And then what I do, so that gives me some information, but then I'll go in again and look at the comments. And you can see where people will say, hey, this was great. And then, other people like, oh, this was stupid. Why didn't you do this and that? So that's another thing you can do to kind of get an idea. I mean, when I started, I thought the School of Podcasting would attract young entrepreneurs in their like 25 to 30-year-old range. And I get some of those, but primarily the audience I attracted, and I think it's because I'm a little older, is, it's often boomers, people in their 60s, and they are thinking of retiring. They've got more time on their hands. They've got a budget, and they've got lots of life experience. And it's interesting because I didn't think that's who I was going to attract, but that's who I attracted. And that's kind of who I now make content for. I still, I always think of it as the entrepreneur that's trying to promote a business, and that's who the content is for. But I think some of it is just you attract similar people to yourself. And so if I make an old reference to an old TV show on, back in 1980, older people are going to get that reference, and they're going to then resonate with me maybe more than somebody who's in their 20s or 30s. So, but those are some things you can do to kind of figure it out. You always have a general. I mean, I didn't have an audience, and I was like, okay, well, who do I think would want this? And so for me, I thought it was, kind of younger people, maybe starting their own business. And like I said, I still get those people, but I definitely get more older people that are trying to come up with a plan B for when they retire.
Yeah, and give back to society.
Yeah. And then
content.
I mean, I have, it's kind of all over the place, but I have churches that want to put their sermons online. I have some people that just want to do an audio diary, which are always easy because they're not trying to make money with their podcast. They just want to, how do I do this without buying a bunch of equipment that I don't need? I want to do this kind of on the cheap. How do I do this? And so I kind of attract all different types, but it's funny. You aim for this and you get a little bit of everything.
Yeah, I think when we start, we don't have all the answers, but we kind of have a compass of where we want to go. And the market will tell us what they want.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's when I do things that they don't want, in a very polite way, they will let me know. I remember once I had I made kind of a promo for the show, and I kind of stole the idea from my guy on radio, and I found this song that I could use legally, and it was this band counting to 3. They're 1, 2, 3, and I'd be like, hey, thanks for listening to the show. If you could do me a favor, listen to 2 more episodes if this is your first one. Give me 3 items because I'll grow on you. And then the band would come in, 1, 2, 3. And then I'd be like, because, and I'd make my next point, and then the band would come back in, 1, 2. And I had like 5 or 6 people the very next day, which is pretty, I mean, it's not a ton of feedback, but a lot of times you get a trickle. And they all said the same thing. Please never play that promo again. That was really annoying. This band and the number 1, 2, 3. They're like, I just don't want to hear that again. And I was like, all right, duly noted. So, but they said it in a loving, caring way. They just, hey, just so you know, That was really annoying. And I'm like, all right, I will not do that again.
Wow. That's really really good. And at some point in time we have to like so I think swallow our ego to like listen to the market and realize that the content we're creating it's for them. I mean, we love to create content, but we're creating the content to serve them. So we could say, well, it's my podcast. I can do anything I want. Why are you telling me what to play?
Yeah. The thing that always makes me scratch my head is I'll have a new person that they've launched their podcast. They come to me to help them grow it. And I'll be like, okay, well, what kind of feedback did you get before you launched? And they'd be like, what do you mean? And I'm like, well, you probably found some people that, are your target audience. You let them listen to the episode and then give you feedback. And they're like, oh, I didn't do that. And I'm like, okay, because if this was a restaurant, you would want people to eat your food before you open the restaurant to prove that they want it. It's just like, so that's the first thing I did. I'm like, well, we need to do an audience survey. We need to do a focus group, because they're like, well, do I need to spend money on advertising? Do I need to do this? Do I need to do that? And I'm like, no, the first thing we need to do is, are you giving people what they want? And I understand why people don't want to do that, because, hey, I just worked 10 hours on this one episode. The last thing I want to do is serve it up for people to critique. And I totally get that. But on the other hand, it makes no sense to promote something that's not going to resonate with your audience. And I find things all the time that, like, I just did an episode and I was talking about a fundraising website that I wanted to promote. And I had two people that said, Dave, I don't know if you realize this, but you got me all hot and bothered, and I was ready to donate, and there's no link in the show notes. And I was like, you got to be kidding me. And I looked at my website. It was on the website, but in the actual media host, I had forgotten to do that. And so I always tell people, I'm like, we don't see our own mistakes because we're too close. So you need somebody that, from an outside point of view, not mom, because mom's going to tell you everything was wonderful, but find somebody with an eye. And it's not that they're going to trash everything you're doing. They're going to help you find that low-hanging fruit that you're like, oh, I didn't even think about that. And that's the stuff you need. They'll also tell you the stuff you're doing great. Hey, this was good. That really resonated with me. Oh, by the way, did you know there's a typo? That kind of stuff. And I'm not quite sure why. I guess we're all just nervous about receiving any kind of negative feedback. But again, as a teacher, that's how we learn. So to me, when I get negative feedback, it's kind of weird. I get excited. I'm like, ooh, I have a chance to improve. And so I don't think everybody shares my attitude towards feedback, but in my opinion, they should.
Yeah, I think receiving feedback, you have to have this humility to say, I know I haven't figured it all out, so I get to listen to them tell me sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's just the first job I got when I graduated with my engineering degree. I worked for a company, and they had these giant signs on the wall that said constant improvement. And that's just always been my mantra from day one, is I'm always looking for ways to improve, which means not that I'm doing things wrong, but I could always do things better. And I'm always open to suggestions.
Yeah. Like the last person we always tend to blame is ourselves. That's the last person we ever want to blame when something goes wrong. And when it comes to content, I feel sometimes the reason why most persons don't want feedback on content, or don't want to get what I like to call the content market fit, right, is because they've attached themselves to the content. They are the content. So if you're critiquing the content, you are critiquing them. And I feel that shouldn't be the case. Like the content, yeah, it's you put passion into it, but it's different from you, right? If someone is critiquing it, it's not they're not if they say the content is bad, they're not saying you are bad, right?
Yeah, exactly. They take it personally, and that's not the case. You hit the nail on the head. I think that's probably it. And I just think, as much as, we think of art as things as you hang on the wall, but there's also musicians and authors and things like that. And I think sometimes, like you said, people identify themselves with their content. And so they may say they're open for feedback, but in the end, they're not, because they worked on this hard. This is how they want it. This is how they chose to present it. And when you go, yeah, but I'm kind of bored in this middle section where you went off for 5 minutes on this one thing that I really don't care about, I don't know that they're open to that, like you said, because they're going to be like, well, it makes sense to me. And I'm like, okay, well, that's fine. That's the beauty of it. You said it earlier. You can do whatever you want. It's your show. I was at podcast movement. And there's an actress. She's also a director. And she was on stage. I cannot think of her name right now. Aisha Tyler. She said, you know what I love about my podcast? And we're all like, what? And she goes, it's mine. She goes, look, she goes, I make a decent money as an actress. I've been on, like, she was on Friends. She was Ross's girlfriend for a while. She's like, I got money. I could hire an editor. She goes, but I love to do it because it's mine. She goes, even your house. You think it's your house, but it's not your house until you pay for it. And she's like, this is something that I don't have to ask anybody's permission. It's mine. And she's like, I love it from a creative standpoint that I can do whatever I want. And so I get that there are some people that it's just a creative outlet and, you know, they may not care about, you know, their audience or making money or whatever. This is just a creative outlet. And that's perfectly fine. You know, there's nothing wrong with that. And that may be the case why some people don't want feedback, but it's tricky. Every single podcast is completely different. And that's why it's hard, because you'll see somebody who does something and you're like, they do this. I'm going to do that for my show. And they have a different audience. So what works on one show may not work on another, you know?
It seems like the response you just gave, it seems like you could read my mind. The follow-up question I wanted to ask you was, we talked about there are so many benefits of podcasting aside making money and all that, and being the top 1%, the top 0.5% and all that. Well, that's fantastic though, but there are other benefits that nobody really talks about because they're not shiny, they're not clickbaity, and they're not what people would want to say, oh, it will go viral on social, right? And for me, for other podcasters out there, not everybody wants to start a podcast because they want to make money, right? Some persons, they already have the money, like enough for them to live by till they are dead, right? But they just want to, like, a means to, like, give back to community. But I want to ask, what forms of creative success metrics could they use to, like, measure their progress, right? Apart from the regular conventional download numbers, top 1% and all those kind of stuff.
Yeah, the top 1% stuff, that stat comes from a website called Listen Notes. And again, sometimes I say things that people disagree with, but that stat's absolute crap, because I have a friend of mine that did a show who hasn't had an episode out in probably 10 years, and he's in the top 7%. And
Wow.
I'm like, so you're ranking up against dead shows that haven't had episodes. That WordPress show from 2010. Congratulations, you're more popular than that. Well, good God, I hope so. But, and this is where, when I see people quoting that either A, you don't understand the stat and how they made it, that's fine, that's forgivable, or you do know that stat is crap, but your audience doesn't, and so you're going to put it in your marketing to make you look better. And I'm like, well, that is marketing and that's fine, but I don't do that. I never quote my listen. I'm in the top 0.5%, but I know that stat is crap. There is that, but some other things you can look at, and I always say be careful what you look for, because people go, well, I wonder if my show is good. And I'm like, okay, go into Apple Podcasts, and you can see how far people listen. And it's kind of weird because the first minute of your show is a giant waterfall. And you go like, why is everybody leaving? Those are your regular listeners, and they've heard your intro a million times, so they know, they don't need to hear it again. And then you can see how far they listen. For me, I have an ad in the middle of my show where I promote my own stuff, and I can see right where it is. There's a little dip where people are hitting fast forward, and then the minute you start to hint that the show is over, they leave like, the place is on fire. You can also do that in Spotify for podcasters. Both those have metrics so you can see how far people listen. So that's some other stats you can use, but you did bring up the other things that you benefit from. One is, I think I'm a better listener than I used to be, because when you're interviewing people, you are actively listening like nobody's business. You are so focused when you're doing an interview. So there's that. And then likewise, kind of being able to improv a bit is a skill that you learn when you're podcasting, because whether it's technology or something's going to come up that you're like, well, this isn't what was planned, but we're going to go with this.
With the flow.
And so I'm going to go with the flow and, make it up. So I've had that where I've been in situations where I was at an event once and they said, hey, we had a speaker cancel at the last minute. Could you talk about this topic? And I go, I don't have any slides, but I could talk about it. And then they're
Yeah.
like, that would be amazing. And I'm like, okay, I can pull 20 minutes out of my butt. Here we go. And the people loved it because it had a certain, I wonder what's going to happen here. And so that kind of had them on the edge of their seats. And then when I actually started and was able to deliver value, they were like, wow, this is amazing. So I think if I'd done that before podcasting, even though I was a teacher, I probably would have been a little more rattled, where after doing it as a podcast, I was like, I got this, no problem.
Yeah. Yeah, like so what there, like you just mentioned, like a lot of benefits from podcasting. Like apart from you might, if you consistently podcast, like let's say for 2 3 years, right? You might not, you
Mm-hmm.
might get a handful of listeners, but one of the things you would just unconsciously get to work on is your speaking and also listening. That's if you're doing interview, but you work on the speaking and you work on organizing your thoughts like in the moment, because sometimes a guest comes up with a story that you probably never heard of before, and you learn to be in the moment, and it flows into your other areas of life, like your interpersonal relationship and all that, because then when you're chatting with people, you're talking to people, you'll be like, wow, the guy is a great listener. He talks, he just has a way of saying the right things at the right time.
Yeah. And it's just, you don't realize that you're developing those skills. I was speaking at an event once, and it was the event organizer and myself and another speaker were on a Zoom call, and he's like, hey, can you guys cut some quick promos for the event? And I'm like, well, what do you mean? He's like, well, just, this is Dave Jackson. I'm going to be such and blah, 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 and join me here and there, and, et cetera, et cetera. And so I just spit one out, and the other speaker looked at me and said, man, you made that look easy. And I go, it's 20 years of talking on a microphone,
Yeah.
And I said, and before that, when I was a teacher, I always ended up partially working with the marketing department. Even when I was at Libsyn, I was doing tech support and I was doing podcasting stuff, but I ended up on their YouTube channel. And it's the same thing when I had my engineering degree. I would get pulled into marketing meetings just because I'm a creative person. So it's one of those things that, over the years, the more you do it, on all of a sudden, it's just like a skill that maybe you didn't even know until you went to do it. And you're like, oh, well, I just do this and that and that whole 9 yards. So yeah, it is a completely different set of skills. And you may not have started a podcast because I want to be a better storyteller or I want to do this or that. It's just, there's side effects of podcasting.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel the reason podcasting is different is the fact that people listen, like the way people consume podcasts is different from other forms of media. People are listening to you, like they just listening to you, unlike let's say 3 second video on Instagram, or maybe YouTube, a 5 minute video on YouTube, or the other forms of media, right? With podcasts, you take up their earbud and it's just you, right? And especially when you're consistent with it, they get to listen to you over and over and over again, and the relationship is just different, right?
Yeah,
To take us back
absolutely.
to the question I asked earlier on, you talked about looking at the audience retention graph in the various podcast analytics to see, okay, how long do people stay when I talk, right? And where are people dropping off? And I think that itself, apart from the fact that you could say my podcast is good, it could also be a way to gauge, oh, how do I talk, right? You could realize that, okay, at the beginning or at the center, people drop, like there was a huge dip in the audience retention graph, and then you go back and you listen to that moment, and you're like, whoa, oh, at that point in time I just started rambling and talking off topic, and oh, that was why. Oh, and then you're like, okay, how do I become more coherent and stuff like that? So it's actually giving you data on how to become a better speaker, and which it's also, you could say, how to make a better podcast.
Absolutely. When first of all, when I do a solo show, I don't do a thing like people do on YouTube where they start off with, hey guys. No, I talk to one person when I do a solo show. It's, hey, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. I'm talking to one person. And I've heard people say, when I listen to your show, I feel like you're talking to me. And I go, that's because I am. So there's that. And then the other thing is, and this is another one that kind of drives me nuts, is, with radio, you don't have a chance to edit. You say it, it's out, and people heard it. And with a podcast, you have a chance to make yourself sound so much smarter. And so if I'm doing an interview, I will ask the question, Then I will listen to the answer. And the first thing I ask myself is, did they answer my question? Because sometimes when you interview people that get interviewed a lot, they have been interviewed so many times, it's like pulling their string and out comes their answer. And sometimes they didn't actually answer the question. You asked them, like, what's your favorite type of pizza? And they said blue. And you're like, wait a minute, that's your favorite color. Wait, hold on. And then if they did answer the question, did it deliver value to my audience? And if it does, it stays. And if they didn't, for whatever reason, doesn't mean they're a bad person, but, maybe it's just not something that my audience is going to find helpful, then I cut the question and the answer. I always say you're the goalie. You're the guy standing in front of the goal, and that goal is your audience. And if somebody tries to feed you content that's not going to resonate, it's your job to swat that stuff away. And it's funny because I think most podcast hosts, they think that the guest is going to come back and listen to every second of that podcast. Well, the guest was there. They know what happened in that interview, and they rarely come back and listen. So I think they're all like, well, he's going to listen and go, hey, what happened to question number 3? And why did you cut that out? I'm like, no, they're not. They don't care. So, it's up to you. Likewise, I had an interview once, and about 20 minutes in, this woman told this story, and I was like, oh, that's so amazing. And there was a part of me in my head that said, it's a bummer. My audience is going to have to wait 20 minutes to hear that. And I was like, well, unless I move it to the front. So I just took the question and the story and moved it to the front. I'm not making them say something that they didn't say. I'm just putting the good stuff up front. And, I always kind of say a podcast is a conversation often, but it should be a conversation with the boring parts removed. And so what resonates with the audience stays. What doesn't is, gone. And then people will ask, well, how long should my podcast be? And I'm like, well, how long can you hold their attention? There's a great book called Beyond Powerful Radio by this woman named Valerie Geller, and it's one of my favorite quotes. She says, there is no such thing as too long, only too boring. And I was like, that's true, because I've listened to 5-minute podcasts that felt like an hour. And I've listened to hour-long podcasts that felt like they were 5 minutes. Yeah. So I always say there's a monument in the States called Mount Rushmore. And it used to be just a big, mountain range or whatever. And they carved a bunch of president faces in it. And I'm like, so Mount Rushmore was a bunch of rocks until somebody did some editing. And I go, you could have a good podcast that could be a great podcast if you did some editing.
Yeah. I think the whole idea is coming back to the audience you're trying to serve and serving them with generosity, because then you're making the content easier for them to consume.
Yeah. I just did an episode on podcasting pet peeves where I asked my audience, I said, what drives you nuts as a listener? And that was one where they said, A, not getting to the good stuff quick enough, and then bad audio and unlevel volume. So if your guest is way louder than you or vice versa. And these are all things that could be easily fixed, and I'm like, so the easiest way to grow your audience is to not drive them away.
Yeah. Like, a lot of us, we are so focused on getting new listeners that we forget about with the listeners we have. How do we keep them?
Yeah, that's it. Because you could see serious audience growth if you keep the ones that you already have. And that's where I see people in groups and they'll be like, hey, I need an interview for this Thursday. Who's available? And they don't even say what their show's about. And I'm like, does that mean you will take anybody with a pulse? I'm like, how is that going to work? So depending, I guess, on the show, but I'm like, not sure about that one. And that's, in that case, a lot of people say, well, should I do an interview show or a solo show? And I go, why are you limiting yourself? Do both. When you do a solo show, you grow your influence. Because again, you're talking to that one person. Like when I do that, I just picture an invisible person on the other side of my desk, and I'm excited to tell them about this topic that I found about. So I'm growing my influence. And when you do an interview show, you grow your network. So why not do both?
Yeah. I think podcasting is one of like the cheat codes to get to speak with your mentors, whatever the industry or the people your heroes or the people you respect so much in the industry you're in. Like if you have an entertainment podcast, for example, right? You could get to interview all in the name of your podcast. You could get to interview some of the big, some of the musicians, actors. I'm
Oh,
just giving an example, right? Or it could be, let's say, a tech podcast. You could get to interview the people you respect in tech and talk to them, all in the name of your podcast, right? Which ordinarily you wouldn't probably have that opportunity to talk to them, like have them talk with you for 1 hour or stuff like that.
oh, absolutely. When my first show was for musicians, and I got to interview all sorts of people that I grew up listening to. And if I had reached out and said, "Hey, can we get on the phone and just have a chat?" They'd be like, "Get out of here,
Nah,
kid, you bother me." But if I said, "Hey, would you like to come on my podcast?" And so I got to all these guys that I grew up listening to, or they were in the band. Like the one guy was the drummer for Ozzy Osbourne, and the bass player from Ozzy Osbourne and Quiet Riots, and all these bands back in the '80s when I was growing up. And I got to talk to them all. So it's always, and it's always funny because you're like, well, there's no way they're going to say yes, and then they say yes, and then you're like, oh crap, what am I going to ask these people? And you got to, do your prep and be ready and be professional and just be ready to do it. But yeah, it's a lot of fun.
yeah, you shared some metrics about how people can measure their progress irrespective of download numbers and all that. And I all those metrics are great and important, but for most of the metrics, they are beyond our control. And oftentimes we so focus on things we can't control that we forget about the things we can control. So tying back on that, what is the significance of being consistent? Just putting out let's say it's once every week or twice, once every 2 weeks, you decide to be the publishing schedule of publishing consistently. Like, how does that have, like, what is the benefit of that for you as a podcaster?
Yeah, it's because you're seen as consistent. It's one of the things that I kind of pride myself on. I work all week and I publish Sunday night, which is basically Monday morning by the time it comes out. And so for almost 20 years, it'll be 20 years in April, I have had an episode out on Monday morning. And that's not only consistent in schedule, it's always my best content that I could create. And I've gotten feedback. I remember one guy said, "You're with me every Monday on the way to the feed store." And then I've had other people, "I start off my week with you, Dave. You're in the shower with me when I start the week." So it's just one of those things where you become part of their routine. And
Yeah,
that is huge. Like I have a show they publish on Friday, and Friday night I have a couple. I always end up running errands. I'm old. I don't go out partying, but I'll run to a couple different stores. But I'm listening to that show. That's my Friday routine. It's like, okay, it's Friday. It's 5:30. It's time to get out of here. Grab my earbuds, grab my phone, get in the car, and turn on that show. So they're part of my
yeah,
Friday routine. So that's one of the things. And what that does is it makes you, whether that was the goal or not, you're seen as reliable. Like, hey, Dave is always there. And that's just a message as an entrepreneur that you want to send out there, is that, I can count on this person. And so what's interesting is I'm almost always at the same time. I've had a couple times when I was traveling and it was out on Monday, but it was out, a couple hours later because I was traveling and I got home late and things like that. And I'll get emails from people like, "Hey, are you okay? Like, where's the show?" Which is
yeah,
best. The worst is like when you don't put out a show and nobody notices. That's heart
yeah.
crushing.
That,
But I have people like, "Hey, are you okay? Like, where's the show at?" And I'm like, I'm working on it. It's going to be published in
yeah,
about 3 hours. "Oh, okay, good. I just want to make sure." So
yeah,
that's the biggest benefit, is you become part of their routine.
yeah. I think that's where podcasting is different from other forms of media. And the funny thing is, that if once you get knocked out of that routine, it's hard to come back to the routine because they find someone else to replace to replace you in that routine. And
Yeah.
consistently creating content allows you to stay there. And I think it's back to the statement we made earlier on, where you talked about the fact that everybody's looking at how to get new listeners. Nobody talks about, okay, how do I retain and keep the listeners I already have? Right? A bird in hand is worth two in the bush.
Yeah. And if I happen to go to an event and somebody comes up and says, "I listened to your show," that person gets my undivided attention, and I'll ask them, and I'll be like, "Why do you listen to the show?" And they'll be
Yeah,
like, "Oh, well, it's always helpful and you're kind of funny." And then I'll say, "Great, how can I make the show better?" And I will shut up. And there will be this awkward silence, and they'll go, I mean, it's and I'm like, "No, seriously, I got extra skin today. Like, is there something you wish I would stop doing?" And I will shut up. I do not say, "Should I make it longer? Should I make it shorter?" I just shut up. And probably, I don't know, 50% of the time, they might say, well, that whole segment about, question of the month, I don't know, that's not really my favorite. Like, they'll give you feedback if you show them it's a safe place, that you're open to feedback. Now, there are plenty of people who go, no, seriously, I love everything about it. Okay, fine. But anytime I meet somebody in person, I'm like, okay, good. Now it's time to do an audience poll. And you have to realize that, these are people that are choosing to listen to you. There's no spam in podcasting. If you don't want to listen to my show, you swipe left, you unsubscribe, and there's nothing I can do about that. And so when people say things like, oh, I've only got 42 downloads an episode, I'm like, okay, I'm an old teacher. That's 2 classrooms of people that could be listening to satellite radio or playing video games or watching Netflix or HBO or whatever. Like, they chose to listen to you. And, I remember once somebody said something about they had 100 downloads an episode. I go, that's a hallway. And they go, what do you mean? I go, at my old building, we had 5 classrooms, 20 students in a classroom. I go, that's a hallway. I would have to walk down the entire hallway to get to those people. I go, you forget they're people, and they chose and they didn't have to. So it's, we get kind of hung up on the big celebrities. Yeah. And they're like, oh, they've got, 300,000 downloads. And you're like, I've only got 120. You're like, that's 6 classrooms of people that could be doing something else.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned about monetization.
Yeah.
I don't go by downloads. My show is meant to monetize now. So like in January, my downloads go up because everybody and their brother is like, this is the year I'm starting a podcast. And like every gym membership in February, my numbers go down, but my membership numbers go up. And so if I based my success on downloads in February, I'd be deeply depressed. But I don't. I base them on my membership, and my membership is going up. So I'm happy as a clam. So that's one of those where you have to define, like, how are you going to measure your success? Because it's not always download. It could be, I want to grow my network. I want to, some of us want to make money, but it's not always downloads. And because if you don't get what you have to define, we talked about, you have to know who your audience is. You also have to know, why am I doing this? Because if you don't get your why, then you'll burn out.
Yeah, very, very important. And then you start doing anything, you start taking any advice anybody tells you, because that's the trendy thing now. That's what everybody's doing. Thank you so much, Dave. Like, it's amazing what happens when you're having an interesting conversation. It's as if I'm looking at the time and I'm like, wow, when did we get to 60 minutes?
Yeah, good conversations go by quick.
Yeah. I'd love to have you on the show sometime in the future, and maybe then we can continue the conversation and go deeply, probably how we can monetize and support ourselves as podcasters. But until then, where can people find you, connect with you, and listen to your podcast episodes, and just check you out and stuff like that?
Yeah, my main website is schoolofpodcasting.com. If you're thinking of starting a podcast, I've got a checklist at schoolofpodcasting.com/checklist. Okay.
The checklist is free, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. Any other thing you like to share?
Just, some people, I always say it's kind of a joke, but it's kind of not. Because a lot of people have what would it be? I guess imposter syndrome, or they just feel nobody would listen to them. And a lot of times that's just baggage in your head from things you did in the past that maybe weren't the smartest decisions or whatever. You are not defined by your mistakes. And this is a chance to kind of start over and with a clean slate and, make a new path for yourself. And so don't let your past dictate your future.
Thank you so much for that advice. Your story is really, really inspiring. Like, most of us that are trying to start a podcast, we're not in such a grand level, grand bottom zero situation like you were when you were in 2005. And it goes to show that some of us, we're just making stuff up, and no matter how the excuse might be, it's not what we'll call it now. It's not good enough, because people don't want excuses. People want things to get done. Thank you so much, Dave. It was great having you on the podcast.
Thank you so much. This has been great.
Yeah, goodbye. I'll send the release date and other details later on Podmatch, and
yeah, I'll be happy to promote it. Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good day or night, whatever it is over there.
Yeah.
So,
all right.
Take care.
That's a wrap for today's episode. If you found this helpful, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who might enjoy it. I also document my journey in my newsletter. Join me there for more insights, updates, and behind-the-scenes content. You can sign up from the link in the show notes in the description of the podcast. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, keep creating, keep growing, and keep pushing forward.